Hey folks, before we begin, if you enjoy what I do here, please subscribe if you haven't, leave a comment, leave a like, follow me on my socials, and now please enjoy the video. As I've said in countless videos before, supernatural horror became the prevailing trend at the turn of the millennium, with America in particular becoming tremendously influenced by the growing impact of J-horror. However, oftentimes these films lacked the nuance and subtlety that made J-horror iconic, resulting in a blow to the genre's reputation in the West due to, let's call it, bombastic outputs, until the torture porn craze began to briefly take over in the mid-2000s. Returning to this era, I was reminded of a curious supernatural flick that I could have sworn was a remake of the J-horror, but it turns out, nope, this one is an original IP, even if I'm stretching the definition of original. Released 20 years ago, White Noise tells the story of a husband and father called Jonathan Rivers, who after the sudden death of his wife, is confronted by a man who claims to communicate with the dead via EVP, electronic voice phenomenon. From here, Jonathan becomes increasingly obsessed with the prospect of reconnecting with his wife, and soon falls down a rabbit hole of collecting audio and visual signals from a plane of existence between the living and the dead, which of course inevitably results in the arrival of a few, let's just call them unsavory spirits that threaten John on his journey for closure. If this movie seems at least somewhat vaguely familiar, it's because White Noise was actually a massive box office hit when released during what later became known as the infamous January dump month. It was absolutely savaged by critics, but with a lack of competition and the modest star power of Batman himself, Michael Keaton, White Noise certainly became the de facto product of its time, or at least for 2005, and the result is... yeah, it's pretty bad. It's not 7% on Rotten Tomatoes bad, however, you're going to want to stick around until the end, and I'm not saying that in a sort of YouTuber bait kind of way, because it genuinely has one of, if not the worst endings to any horror movie I have ever seen, so brace yourself. White Noise opens by surrendering its hand a little early in attempting to make American inventor Thomas Edison sound ominous with a vague quote about recording sound before giving us an arbitrary definition of EVP. We're then interrupted by the violent tuning of static to evoke the sense of disturbance that foreshadows the evil that eventually intercepts Jonathan's journey. The transition into generic, whimsical piano music, a bright, picturesque setting, and a happy Hollywood family artifice pretty much tells you exactly what stock template of a horror movie you're watching. Jonathan and his wife Anna are renowned professionals in their fields, they have a loving son called Mikey, and OMG, Anna is pregnant. Quick, Jonathan's assistant, get him a bouquet of flowers and Anna's favorite chocolates because nothing can possibly ruin such a glorious day.
Order me a bouquet of flowers at the end of the day, okay? Lilies. Give me chocolates, big box, those Belgian kind.
What results is a reverse Jack Frost, where you damn well know Anna is not coming home from her out-of-town business trip. There's actually a jarring poetic irony to what happens here, because Anna is supposed to meet with her publisher to finalize her upcoming book that is aptly named The Eternal Wait, while Jonathan meanwhile longingly awaits her return, only for the police arrive and reveal her car was discovered abandoned by a secluded lake, but her body was nowhere to be found. On paper, it's tragic, especially given how literal Jonathan's eternal wait has now become, but it simply doesn't make the sincere effort to involve us emotionally. We see a montage of a distraught Jonathan becoming increasingly depressed as the atmosphere gets gloomier before settling into your moderately average early autumn weather. After several weeks pass, Jonathan finds himself followed by a mysterious man called Raymond Price, who reveals he's been receiving messages from Anna from beyond the grave. Jonathan initially dismisses the superstition at first, but soon Anna's body is recovered from the lake, with the coroners believing she died from drowning after falling and breaking several of her limbs. You're going to want to remember that detail because it will play a part in the finale, but for now, at first, I did appreciate appreciate what the film seemed to be going for thematically. Ultimately, White Noise was about a husband trying to find closure for his grief and learn to live with an untimely tragedy. It expresses the promise of a hopeful resolution, especially after Raymond expresses how EVP helped him to overcome suicidal depression after he managed to communicate with his deceased son, who told his father he was at peace. There's no doubt it conveys a spiritual undercurrent depending on your own beliefs, but 6 months on, Jonathan and his son Mikey, who he will eventually forget about, move into an apartment with the help of his friend Gian. Now, to Michael Keaton's credit, he certainly does the best with the material he has to work with. It may not emotionally involve us to the extent I feel it should. In fact, its attempts at emotion feel like daytime soap opera levels of soppiness, but Keaton certainly adds a humanity that's needed. It's a shame how cold it feels, but I question if that's maybe the point, because there are a few shots I wish it lingered on longer to really sell the emptiness in Jonathan's life and the increasing restless presence he begins experiencing. In particular, the use of windows and reflections do seem to infer symbolically to not only the plane of existence between life and death, but how the world itself is moving on without Jonathan as he stagnates in his own grief. Yet, since the movie moves at such a brisk pace, it just never seems confident in letting that sentimental imagery ferment. Anyway, John eventually receives a call from Anna and contacts Price for guidance on EVP. Price explains that he cannot contact the dead directly, but rather the spirits have to come to him, to which he simply records the audio and visuals and passes them on to the bereaved. However, as John awaits Anna to contact him again, he's intercepted by hateful negative voices that read like your average Twitter account or YouTube comment section, which Price logs but then promptly deletes. While it does pose this thematically spiritual undercurrent of listening to the angels and ignoring the demons, it becomes clear that the intruders can impact the physical world when John later returns to discover Price dead in his own home. Now, while granted we are approaching the halfway mark at this point, it's actually here where the film does finally begin to pick up, when John becomes obsessed with trying to reconnect with Anna to the point of seeking the help of a timid psychic who becomes distressed at the negative aura surrounding John due to his exposure to EVP. She explains that like seances and Ouija boards, using EVP unsupervised is dangerous because there's basically no filter on what spirits may come through, thus exposing John to potentially evil and demonic entities that she refers to as the ones who like damage, and unfortunately that's it in terms of lore. However, due to John's increasing depression and desperation, he ignores her warnings and sets up his own EVP system and effectively continues Price's operations. From here, the film very briefly leans into a similar concept to the Mothman prophecies, where superstition becomes a vessel to explore grief, hope, memories, and finding peace within the messy ubiquity of death. For example, easily the most emotionally cathartic scene is when John receives signals from the grandmother of a grieving girl called Susie and brings her the images to help her find comfort. However, the twist comes when Susie reveals that her grandmother only passed away 2 days ago, despite John having received the signal weeks in advance. Now, side note, shockingly, the film never hones in on the point that John has completely lost track of just how much time has passed and how disconnected he's become from reality since involving himself in EVP. In fact, not only has he taken a prolonged sabbatical from work, but he's neglected his own son Mikey into the care of his friend Gian while he deals with his grief. He's simply unable to move on with his life. He's trapped in his own limbo, waiting for Anna to communicate from hers so he can be finally free. It's much more heartbreaking when you read between the lines of what's happening, but it never shows. This desire to spend one last moment with his wife and say goodbye is so palpable and real, and I'm just waiting for that guttural moment to finally happen. However, the movie doesn't quite go in the direction it seems to be implying, because just as it finally gets to a thematically resonating place, granted we're about an hour into the film at this point, it decides to divert your attention in an entirely different direction by introducing premonitions. As I mentioned with the Mothman prophecies concept, I like this reveal in theory. It is a decent twist, but it feels like someone just took over writing duties at the last minute and completely ignored everything thematically set up in the first half. So after his revelation with Susie, it turns out that EVP signals are foretelling of events that are yet to happen involving spirits that are yet to be deceased. Okay, so bear with me here, but the main example it uses is when John is out driving one night and comes across an overturned car that's insinuated to be the work of these 3 demon spirits that are shown throughout the film that represent the ones who like damage. The trigger here is when John sees the mother distressed from inside the car, and it mirrors a visual signal he receives earlier, and while John is able to save the baby, the mother unfortunately dies, prompting John to attend the funeral and comfort the father, reflecting his first interaction with Price, only to be understandably scorned by the father for his hysterics. Out of this, John somehow comes to believe that Anna is actually trying to warn him about future events so he can intervene and save the day, which ends up focusing specifically on a kidnapping subplot about a missing woman called Mary. However, before we get to this batshit insane reveal, just to make things even more confusing, early in the story, John actually befriends one of Price's other clients called Sarah, who has been trying to make peace with her deceased fiance, and discovers that the demons might be targeting her. If that sounds out of left field, trust me, it feels that way watching the film, because Sarah doesn't bring any value or meaning to the story. At the very least, you would think she might be an auxiliary love interest or an exposition dumper or helping John in his investigation, but nope, she's just kind of there. It would be welcome and meaningful if she was an emotional counterweight to John's obsessive journey in trying to get him back on track, but ultimately the entire point of her character is to see the demons seemingly possess her into jumping off her balcony, yet she miraculously survives. You can see by this point that the movie is just scattershot with its ideas. The themes it opens with don't synergize with the demons or premonition angle it introduces in its second half. I mean, there is definitely still potential here, but it just feels like 2 drafts from 2 very different ghost stories stitched together. The villains themselves are rightfully ambivalent. They don't need to justify their wickedness or specifically mean anything to John, but the complete vagueness of what they are and how they tie into what starts as a story about grief leaves them tonally confused and misplaced. It all serves to set up this absolutely bonkers out of nowhere plot twist that even M. Night Shyamalan would call far-fetched. So for the last time, brace yourself. So, after comforting and saying goodbye to Sarah, John returns to find his apartment seemingly ravaged by the spirits, and he receives another cryptic message from Anna indicating the location of the abducted woman Mary, who appears to be in an abandoned factory next to the site where Anna's body was uncovered. John even ends up implicating himself after a cop who interrogated him directly after both Sarah's fall and Prince's death arrives at his apartment to find the same message on John's computer, as if he conspired in the kidnapping. In what has suddenly become a fucking crime thriller, John calls the cop to give him the location and ends up entering the factory alone, where he finally gets to speak to Anna one last time. However, it is not the sentimental, heartfelt moment you are expecting. Instead, underwhelmingly, Anna simply warns him about the impending danger, but overwhelmingly, as he proceeds further along, he finds Mary, who has been kidnapped by this random guy who works for John and is shown very briefly for about 3 seconds earlier in the film. It turns out this guy even has his own EVP setup and is working for the ones who like damage to devise a snuff torture setup for their amusement or something, to which it's then greatly implied Anna was actually murdered by this guy. The damage these demons like is not emotional pain as one might thematically expect. It's actually just physical pain, and before John can swoop in and save the day, he's brutally mangled by the 3 spirits who then throw him to his death. You can now see what I mean when I said in the beginning about the supernatural trend being overtaken by the torture porn trend in the mid-2000s. It is horrifically mean-spirited and completely unearned. The cops then arrive and kill the guy, and the ending only goes on to double down on its bitter bleakness. After John's funeral, his spirit contacts his son Mikey one last time, and sadly apologizes for abandoning him, to which Mikey smiles as if that's supposed to bring him a sense of peace and closure. Oh, but we're not done yet. The last shot sees a wheelchair-bound Sarah mourning John and is implied to be attacked by the three spirits off-screen. The last title card then fearmongers the apathy of evil spirits, as if the spirits ironically possess the director to end the film this way. It is utterly bewildering why the movie suddenly decides to become this cruel. It's as if they saw the success of Saw 1 a few months back and thought, oh shit, torture porn is about to become in vogue, we better shift gears, quick. For as entertainingly scary as they are, it makes me wonder if the Smile films took the same indirectly negative message from this. I can see the potential of what this ending could have been if the story was building towards the revelation of a serial killer, or in fact had John actually killed Anna. Maybe if Anna's body was never found and the premise was about her spirit guiding Jonathan to finding her, not so much so that she can rest at peace and he can have his closure, but so that he does good by saving others from future tragedy. Hell, this would tie into Raymond Price's philosophy of ignoring the bad voices and pursuing the good. Remember when the movie originally promised hope? Granted, now that I think about it, some of that idea is already pretty similar to the premise of The Ring and Dark Water, but since white noise is already lifting from other J-horrors, why not make it a pick and mix? Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like, a comment, a subscribe if you haven't, follow me on all my socials, and until next time, stay safe, stay away from electronic voices, happy Halloween, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Please leave a comment with your thoughts. Oh my goodness, what is all that?